Hello and welcome to another episode of Invalid Entry. My name is James Taylor and today I'm going to talk about a quirk or issue that I've been having with my new website for the past 2 or 3 weeks. We're working on it off and on again. I wanted a way of making new achievements, and by the way, when I set out to make ham achievements, I thought I was making a radio website. I thought this is something I know a little bit about. I've had my amateur radio license now for quite a while, and I was always disappointed with the quality of some of the achievements websites, the things I thought you could do with them. So I wanted to look at making achievements which encourage people not by just completing the achievement but sort of working a way up to an achievement, and could do more interesting achievements such as looking at power over distance, those kind of things, sort of things you do in contesting but you might not want to take part in contests, you might just work towards over time. And one of the things that caught my eye was, the easy low-hanging fruit as such is geographic achievements. So you see a lot of these work every country, work every state. And I wanted a way to do that which would allow me to run it for almost any country in the world without a massive amount of work per country. So I sat down, I wrote a thing which allow me to take GeoJSON files, shape files, and most countries have either an official source of GeoJSON files from the government of that country or an open source equivalent of it, and it allows you to very rapidly build something like this. Let me go there. So this is the counties of the UK. It is the GeoJSON file for this comes from the government. It's an open source license, so anyone can use it for commercial reasons as well. And with some of the GeoPandas stuff, it's very easy to get a collection of points and just say, are these points these shapes? And the shapes sent over that, they are good quality shapes. There's a whole bunch of stuff that comes out really rapidly when you're starting to do this. And I sort of, at the back of my head, knew there would be issues, and I wasn't expecting to see any of these issues or get any complaints about these issues for maybe 10,000 or 100,000 contacts. I really thought we'd get a long way into the life of the website before someone would go, hey, this isn't right. And what happened is I did very quickly, I built the UK version, I built the US version, I built the Canadian version as well, because I could get states, I can get territories and provinces, and I can get counties. And I built that and threw it on the website. And went to my dad and was like, hey, built this thing, and almost immediately he went, it's wrong. What he said was, oh, this is rubbish. Look, there must be a problem with your programming because I've already got main. And I realised my mum watches this and she's going to complain about that, but I also know my dad's going to find that funny. So what we basically found was that when we went to look at the American states was, first of all, there's another problem here, which was scale of maps. You want to be inclusive. So you may notice here there's US states, and how many US states are there? There's 50 US states, but I've got 56. And that's because I've also got Guam, and I've got Marina Islands, and I've got Puerto Rico, and I've got some other places which aren't states. Now, to get 50 points, to get all 5 stars, you only have to work 50 of them. So technically you can get 5 stars on this without working on 56, and you can get 5 stars without working on 56. And the other thing I think about this is really interesting is that my dad's trying to work the 50 states. I know this is like a current goal of his, is to work one person each state. And he currently has, I know it says it's me here, but I've loaded my dad's data in. This is my test site. And actually it's really interesting because he's working it from somewhere over here. So it's really easy, I think. I say really easy, it's still an achievement. But if someone was living maybe in Denver over here, it is easier for them to work every state because they're closer to Hawaii and they're closer to Alaska than it is for someone over here. And arguably it's easier for someone in Britain to work every state than it is for someone in Italy or for someone in Saudi Arabia or somewhere, because you can go over the top as well. So you can argue someone in Finland has it easier than us, but at time of day, time of year, those kinds of things come into play as well. So an achievement for one person is not necessarily an achievement for another person, but it also may be a massive thing for another. So it all depends where you are, what equipment you've got, what land you've got to put up antennas, what sort of frequencies. You can put your own spin on it. But the rules for this one were any amateur band, any modal modulation, work any country. And I decided not to base this on call signs. So the first thing I realised that in the US, all call signs are published. So you can go and look someone up, you can look up their address, you can look up their licence details. It's not true of other countries. You can't, for example, in the UK, I'm in the book of allocated call signs. You can do a freedom of information request and say, is my call sign, what call signs are taken and what aren't. But you can't get my name and address back from the government. But just how we deal with privacy differently in different countries. There's no real pros or cons when it comes to radio licensing. My locator is broadcast. It is on various databases because I have broadcast my locator. I use Maidenhead locators to do that. So it's really interesting here that there's a little red state here, and my dad was immediately like, no, I have worked that state. And he has. He's worked really hard. So the first question is why? And all of a sudden there are a bunch of reasons what comes back. So the first problem with this map is that to get the scale of it is terrible. Projections of map are terrible, especially when you're a country like the US, which goes from Guam all the way around. It's even worse if you're got outlying parts of your country. So France has part of France down here. Arguably, if I drew the UK, do I put the Falklands in, which is all the way down here, some other islands, and arguably there's things like, do you stop putting embassies in because they're all the way around the world? It gets really complicated really fast. The first question was, I went and said, well, why was this coordinate problemsome? And the first problem was I actually used something called Maidenhead locators. So without giving away too much information about this particular contact, even though his contact details are online, his locator is inside the FN65HF grid. Okay, so these are the FN65IE grid. So he's somewhere in this box. And what's interesting about this box is it contains mostly Canada, or Canada makes up about 3/4 of this box. So I realised very quickly that I had attributed this particular call sign to Canada, even though it is a US call sign. The other problem is that there's no guarantee of call signs at home, and we'll come on to that in a moment, but in the UK, if I'm not at my registered address, I have to use a bit on the end of my call sign, so I have to use /mobile, /portable, /temporary location, /T's, those kinds of things. But that's not true for other countries, so no guarantee the guy's at home. However, if he had crossed the border, he would have modified his call sign. There are laws about that, I do know that one. So he hasn't crossed the border. But what I was doing was I was ignoring the coordinates. My dad's log records are pretty complete. He fills up all the fields. He has automation for the fields. And I ignore most of those fields, but I don't ignore the locator. So I took the locator and I worked out, for a while I was using the bottom left corner, especially for the Christmas. It didn't really matter. I just wanted to know if the box was full or not. But I worked out the middle part of the box. And the middle part of the box here is on the left-hand side of this river. So it's actually in a place called Union. I think it's called Grand Union. And so, well, that's why he didn't work in, because his box, the grid square you worked, I would count that as a Canadian grid square, not a US grid square. If we're doing grid squares, that's what that is. End of the story. And he was like, no, this is blatantly a US call sign. Blatantly someone in the US, someone in Maine. I want it ticked off. And unfortunately, in this particular case, he's only got one person who's worked in Maine. So it really matters. If he'd worked another person, we wouldn't be having this debate. So I started looking at this a bit more. How close, how accurate was the information? Now, what's really interesting is that I actually have the contact's full address. So we know exactly where this guy lives. And we can look it up. And the problem is this peninsula here is really interesting. This is where we start getting into what is a country, what is the thing. So just to show how close, actually no, I'll go do it in a second. The next one I show you is actually the shape file. So the first question is, I use a shape file. How accurate is the shape file? When you use a shape file, they often come in different flavors. And the flavors is the accuracy of the curves. So the more accurate the curve, the more, especially on these ones where if you zoom out a bit, if I'll go into this one, this is my shape file overlaid onto a map using GeoJSON. That's my shape file. It's all my shape files, the US. These lines here are easy. You've got a point here, you've got a point here where it bends and then it goes down. There's another point down here, it gets squiggly again. And these are nice, and then this one's nice. There's a point there and a point there, bang, the line goes straight across. a lot of treaties, though, define their countries as like the midpoint of a river. And if you want to draw a map and you want to be this far zoomed out, you don't want a lot of points. You don't actually want every single meter of the river with a point on it, because it's going to take a lot of computational power when you come to manipulate it. So when you start manipulating these things and saying either pointing or out it, 95% of the time the point's going to be in this area. But we're talking about Calais, which is this little peninsula here. So when you start zooming in, you realise that actually my shapefile doesn't really follow the line perfectly. The other thing is that the actual treaty, I believe, goes back to about 1880 something. So it says the midpoint of the river back in 1880, or even earlier, 17, whatever the revolution of America was, when they had the treaty, when the American War of Independence finished and they formed the treaty, they drew the line of Canada. They got it wrong because they went, oh, it goes from here to where the Mississippi comes, and the Mississippi doesn't go that high. So there's all kinds of weird. And then they argued about it. They disputed. There was a big dispute up until halfway through Queen Victoria's reign, where they actually said, no, you're right. Okay, we're going to work this out, and a whole chunk of this became proper Canada. So the UK claimed most of this up until mid-Victoria, and the US claimed all the way up to here until at the same time they got a treaty in. Which is why some of these lines are nice and straight, because they just said, right, drawing a line. But these squiggly ones, these very tight ones, are either following mountain ranges or rivers or oceans. So that's what we've got here. We've got a nice river, and rivers move. So we're looking at where the river was back, 150 years ago. Midpoint of the river, keep it nice and simple. And as you see here, my line goes in and out. So there's bits here where this is very definitely the US. But if the person was in this area, then my system, even with full accuracy of the point, would say that they're in Canada, or that at least they're not in Maine. It won't necessarily be in Canada, because I'll use the Canadian grid, and the Canadian grid might chop that off as well. So there may be no man's land between two countries, and that happens. It happens in reality as well as in where people say, no, I have that, and people say, no, you don't. So 2 islands, one on one side, one on the other. So yeah, this grid, this shapefile isn't perfect, but I don't necessarily want a more accurate shapefile. And when we're zoomed in this far, we're talking about 100-meter points at this point. We're talking really, really quite detailed. When you consider the entire grid goes all the way around, that's an awful lot of polygons. That's an awful lot of points to take into account when you're asking, is this point inside? When you're doing a calculation at this point inside, I don't care about the detail up here. So it does matter. So yeah, was the shapefile accurate? Does he fall inside or outside the shapefile? And to answer that question is, when I do the calculation, he falls outside. He actually falls in on this little dip there on the calculation, and it's all because that's the centre of the grid square. So this all comes down to fluke, that he lives in this little peninsula where, if he was any further south, the width would be wider. And he is really, this is the more accurate map here. And just to give a bit more information on this map, if I can draw a distance, the width from Canada to Canada is 3 kilometres at this point. So the green dot is actually where his locator should be, and the blue dot is the centre of the grid square that he's in. And the delta here is tiny. The delta here is 2.5 kilometres accuracy, which is beginning to get into, you're beyond 3 decimal points of accuracy on the calculations. And the calculations cause some of these headache and cause the problem why it took me so long to diagnose what is going on. So we've got 2 problems now. First problem is, whose coordinates do I trust? So we've got to look at the data flow. When my dad does the exchange, he actually used FT8. Now in FT8, you don't pass a 6-digit locator, you pass a 4-digit locator, which actually means, going back to this one, he wasn't passing FN FN65IE, he was doing FN65. Now FN65 is a much bigger grid, like that, and it's even clearer here. The middle of FN65 is definitely in Canada. This is Canada. This is the US here. And you see that was that little hook there. It was a tiny, tiny little hook there. So via the data that was exchanged in the QSO, this guy is not in the US. he is in the US. There is no doubt this guy's in the US. And so does this count, though, as a US contact? Does it count? If you're in a contest mode and you're measuring distance, you would go from the point of the exchange QSO, not some other record. And at this point, this is the start of it. So what had happened was, sort of looking at data flow, what's going on now is, where is my diagram tool? Here it is. So what is actually happening is my dad uses WSJ like everyone else does in the world. They're using these tools, and he actually also augments. So he's getting information over the radio, and this information, I won't use a dotted line because it's hard to see. This information says something along the lines of, I am X, I am at FN, what did I say the call sign was? FN 86, which is quite a large area to be sending information from. It's not very accurate. With the modern miracle of the internet, there are things like QRZ.com, where this gentleman had uploaded his location information from it. So WSJGX has augments that information by looking it up on there, and it basically says, okay, I've actually now got a north and a west, and I've also got a 6-digit locator, or 6 character, which is a much more precise locator. This that is passed over. My dad is a filthy Windows user, so it gets passed over. I'm still drawing dotted lines. Passed over to Ham Radio Deluxe. I used to love Ham Radio Deluxe. Now I'm less keen. I use a Mac Logger DX, because I'm a Mac user. Now, at this point, he does an export. He does native export, and he uploads that to Ham Achievements, where I get involved. Now, the first question is, what coordinate did I use? Now, I basically ignored the coordinates that he had in his log, and I began to use, at this point, a calculated coordinate. So I basically then created an XY chord, or a lat long chord, using decimalize. So I would go minus 67.1, whatever the coordinates are. That's the longitude I ended up with. At this point, though, we're not storing that. This is actually storing a west 67, and then it stores something like, I'm going to just change this figure here a second to 25, 26, right, like that. Okay. It stores this figure here in the format using decimalized minutes. Now, decimalized minutes means that this would be 15.01, something like that. It actually stores it to 3 decimal places. What this figure here is, usually you'll see a 0 there, so it means it's 67 degrees west, or in my case, minus 67. 15 minutes, or 15.001 minutes. This can go up to 999, so it's actually 1501 times 1/60th. So it's 1 over 60 times 15.001 to get the decimal fraction of the 67, and you add that together, and because it's west, there's a minus 0011 at that point. So I was there. So there's all kinds of floating point calculations. There's all kinds of simplifications. There's a level of accuracy here. Maybe that was the wrong number of decimal places. Maybe that was wrong. There is a conversion factor going on when I convert it to get a floating point here. There's how many decimal points should I store here? Because actually, when you start looking at the difference between 4 or 5 decimal places, is the difference of 200-300 meters, 400, 500 meters on a map at that altitude. At different altitudes, it has an even bigger effect. So the further you go to the equator, the third or fourth decimal place has a bigger effect when you go left to right. It doesn't have a big effect going north-south. It does on the longitude. So there's all kinds of elements where the risk could come in. What we finally found, and by the way, we argued about this now for several days. I went away and did some work when I came back, and he said, look, my data clearly shows when I do the maths, I take my northwest and convert it to latitude longitude, it gives me a point which is very clearly inside the USA. And I agree with him. When I took the figures, he pasted me his logs again, and I looked at them again, and they were very clearly inside the USA. And his argument was that I shouldn't have been using the centre point of the grid square. I was like, yeah, that's fair. If you've got more accurate information, you should use that more accurate information. Now, there are some problems here. The first problem is that we're assuming the person's at home, and therefore the information on QRZ.com is correct. And the reality is, I and Ham Achievements don't know that that's what you've done. I don't know that you didn't exchange a 4, 5, 6 digit. You could be using PSK, you could be using voice, you could be given a very accurate location. You could say, I'm stood right underneath the apple tree at the top of the hill. The information in your log will have varying degrees of accuracy, log line to log line, person to person. What we also then discovered actually was that the QRZ information may have been updated, because there was a button in HRD which was refresh. So it says, yes, refresh the information that you have about this person. So months after the contact, you could actually come along and say, yes, what is this? Who is this person? Update their information. And it corrected, it actually changed the westing here, and it changed the westing, it reduced that significantly enough to put them back inside the USA. And what this is a problem is that basically inside of Ham Achievements, I have a second module, which is my individual achievement. And I'm looking at the record. So as I load the log files in, what I do is I create a record. And those records basically have the grid square, it has your lat, it has your long, it has a grid square of 6. It's called like grid 6. It has grid 4, and it has grid 2 as well. It's actually called grid. It might be called good as far as I know. So, and I have lat, and I have long. And this means I can query very accurately these different things. I haven't yet processed, say, yes, it's this country or this region for various reasons. And then what I can do here is I can then query that. And I'm able with GeoPandas take all the lat and longs as a big data table and just say, what polygons are they in? Give me that back as a grid. And that gives my output. And it's very efficient, very, very efficient. But what we now have to do is actually change this. Say what you have is the user lat, the user long, and then you'll have grid lat and grid long. And that allows me then the achievement to actually specify in the rules to say this achievement will use grid lat. Or if I've done database lookups and I've actually looked up the country and looked up state, I might be able to actually do country and state via DB and then say this will use call sign to identify country, or use call sign to identify your state where that's applicable. And that hopefully will reduce complaints and say, look, it doesn't matter, this call sign, as far as I care, for the purposes of a geographic achievement, is a Canadian contact, and therefore you get a point for New Brunswick. And it is that simple. It's saying, how do you decide if I register that I've worked a main contact and I've given my coordinates as FN56, does that count as a main contact or not? The next generation of this actually was, I was hoping to start building out contacts or competitions for countries or states. You could pick a state like a province or a territory like New Brunswick and find all the grids which cover it, and then you can say, I'm going to start a new worked or New Brunswick competition, for example. So this will be one. And you start saying, well, what happens if I have a grid over here which is mostly C, or if I have one that just clips the border, if there's an island here which belongs to Canada, do I have to have that grid included? I think you can easily say, look, if more than 2/3 of the grid is covered by your country, then you have to have worked that state. So arguably this one doesn't have to be worked to have covered all of Maine. I think we'll have to play with what the figures look like and what coverage you actually have of your target area. But it should mean I'm able to develop new types of competition or new challenges, which people may or may not find interesting. Depends on your use, depends on your locality, depends on how many other things you've got going on in the area to work. If you're living in New Brunswick, you've got loads of people to work in America, across the US and abroad. So yeah, that was quite a heavy amount of decoding, of translating various different ways to measure where someone is, and each one of these has a varied amount of error. And as I said, I was honestly expecting there to be this kind of problem where someone said, I've worked a call sign, but actually it shows up in a different country. Given the size of Maine, I was expecting the smaller grid especially to be 1,000, be a 10,000, not for that problem to appear within the first 1,000 log entries, which my dad has like 800, 900 log entries over the past 4 or 5 years when he started collecting locators. And it's just astounding that it happened in such a quite an interesting way. Of course, there was lots of joking about, it's obviously the code. The code's obviously wrong. It took a long time for us to diagnose where there was a data glitch, especially as Ham Radio Deluxe had updated the record halfway through. Now, luckily, I had a copy of the record back from when I was doing some beta testing back in November, December. And I could show that the original record, which was the record I was running off, was a different value, and therefore my calculations were right. I spent a long time thinking that my calculations were wrong. The challenge now is communicating that to people when they're looking at their achievements. So when you come to the website and you're on this website, and I've got to communicate it saying, well, why does Maine here have 0? There's not easy to say, that one didn't count because I don't know. It should have counted. If I knew it should have counted, I would have counted it. And I want this to be fair. I wanted this to work for countries which don't publish their locators. So, for example, the UK, when I'm looking at these Work UK, there could have been someone right on this border here, which is counted as Norfolk rather than Suffolk, or there could be, was this person really in this county, or were they just across the border? It will matter more for people doing long range where it's hard, or for working in remote areas. Especially when they're in. And the reality is, if you really want to hammer it, you want to work 2 people in each state. That's what it comes down to. You want to double up those states, not just go just for one and move on, get a second contact. Really guarantee that those contacts are made. But that can be hard. I respect that can be hard. That is an incredibly long tale about the accuracy of geolocating. I will put some code online later about how to do is a point within a geoshape file, or I'll do a walkthrough if people are interested. But yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. And if you're interested in more Python, I know there's going to be another video later this week about Python decorators, which is as nerdy and geeky as it sounds, I'm afraid. But yeah, until then, thank you very much.